Carta, we released not only our second annual study on the gender equity gap, but we also released a new initiative called Table Stakes. And the goal of Table Stakes is to leverage Carta data to help get more women on cap tables and help promote fair equity practices. Like Kate said, we don't have to do this. We want to do it because our mission at Carta is to create owners and increase liquidity and transparency for shareholders. So we really believe that there are major discrepancies and problems with private company ownership that we can correct. And so Table Stakes is our initiative to put forward some of these ideas and some of this data. And so we started Table Stakes and released a whole bunch of data on Monday, and it's been an exciting week, and I'm happy to walk you guys through this. It's a little depressing, but I try to make it hopeful. So just a warning, you might be depressed and hungry after this, but but then you'll eat and you'll feel better because we're around all of these amazing women who can help solve the problem. All right, let's do it. So we all know that there's a salary gap. It's typically cited as 81 cents on the dollar. Use my clicker. But there's also an equity gap, and the equity gap is bigger than the salary gap. The equity gap for employees is 49 cents on the dollar. For founders, it's 48 cents on the dollar. What does that mean? That means for every man that holds $1 of equity, a woman holds 49 cents or 48 cents if you're a founder. It's really, really not great. It's a huge gap. So I'll dive into why that exists. But first, why does this matter? This matters for, I think you guys all probably, or you, not you guys, you women, sorry, and a few men, probably understand why this matters. But sometimes I speak to rooms full of men about this, and they really don't understand why it matters. And it matters because the employees on cap tables today or at tech companies today are the founders and investors of the future. And the founders and investors of the future tend to invest and hire early employees or invest in companies with people that look like them. My example is that I wear a lot of denim and I drink a lot of Diet Coke, so I like to hire people who wear a lot of denim and feel comfortable with me drinking Diet Coke at 9 a.m. in an interview. We all have these unconscious biases. Mine are particularly weird. But so we need to get more women on cap tables at every level in investor roles, founder roles, and employee roles. So backing up, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with what a cap table is. I'll make it really simple for you. It's a list of owners and how much they own. That's all it is. And Carta has over 13,000 of these on our platform. So we have 13,000 cap tables, and we're able to aggregate and anonymize that data to look at things like the gender equity gap. So in this particular study, we have a subset of our data. Some of our data has to get thrown out for various reasons that I won't go into now. But we have 350,000 people in this study, individuals. And we have $10 billion in equity value in this study. A couple of notes. This study is women and men only. Unfortunately, while we recognize that gender is non-binary, we do not have the data to dig into that. We also cannot look at investors in this study because investors on cap tables are represented as funds, so they're not individual people. We also can't look into other demographics right now, like ethnicity, because in our data and in publicly available data sets, we just can't do that. We hope to do all of those things in the future. All right, so what's an equity gap? Sometimes, especially when I talk to press, they're like, oh, yeah, of course, there's less women in tech. No, that's not what a gap is. I mean, it is, but it's not what we're talking about when we talk about the salary gap or the equity gap. The problem is that not only are there fewer women, but the percentage of women does not match the percent of the equity value they hold. So let me explain that to you. So did this like animate in and do its thing? Yeah, okay. Employees at companies with Carta cap tables. 34% of employees are women. If there was no gap, it would be that they own 34% of the equity. They hold 20% of the equity. 34% hold 20%. What that means is that there's a 49-cent gap. And when we look at this for founders, we see that there's a 48 cents gap, and that is 48 cents gap. That's kind of grammar. So what's happening there is 13% of founders are women, and they hold 7% of the equity that founders hold. So that's where that gap comes from. And then the overall gap is 26 cents when you combine all founders and employees. And you might be saying to yourself, Emily, you're terrible at math. And what I say is that I was a math major for a full semester in college, so I'm an expert. And then I became an art history major because I realized that I'm not that great at math. But our data scientists did this for us. And so what happens is when you have a small group of people that hold a lot of equity, in this case, founders, something happens called Simpson's paradox. And you can read about this on Wikipedia. Oh, in my old version, there's actually the Simpsons pop up, because that's just fun. But it didn't happen this time, so we'll roll with it. But imagine the Simpsons pop up, and you remember that if you ever want to dazzle people with your math skills, you can talk about Simpson's paradox. And that means that a 49 and 48 cents gap leads to a 26-cent gap overall in equity for employees and founders, which is really, really motivating to fix it. All right, so why? So this year we were able to figure out that the reason why is not actually, this is the best news I have. It's not because people in the same role at the same time get different amounts of equity. That would mean that if an engineer that's a man and a woman join on the same day in the same role, same level of experience, that they get the same amount. We find that that's true, that they're in the same range. That's great. That's progress in and of itself. But women aren't in the right roles, and they're not in the right roles at the right time. So there are a few roles that get outsized equity. You probably know what they are anecdotally. We know what they are from data as well. They're founders, so great for all of you founding companies. They're founders, they're early employees, they're engineers, and they're executives. And women aren't in those roles. So some quick stats, diving in. 1 in 8 CEOs is a woman. Aligns with founders. We do not have enough women in C-level roles, especially in CEO roles, and CEOs get significantly more equity than any other C-level position. So let's look at that. So there's a lot going on in this chart, but here's what this is telling us. First of all, it shows you that CEOs get more equity. That's the gray line. What you're looking at here, though, is if you look at CMOs and COOs, that's where the percentage of women in those in C-level roles goes up. So there are more women in CMO and COO roles than in any other C-level role. But what you see is simultaneously the amount of equity they get goes down. And while the numbers show that we're in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, this is the amount of value based on the 409A valuation, which is lower typically than the VC valuation at a round. So what this actually translates for a successful company can be millions or 10 millions of dollars. So kind of bullshit. I don't use bullshit for this topic when there's a lot of men in the room, but here, kind of bullshit that as we get more women in roles, the amount of equity they get goes down. And I think we need to take a systematic look at how we're issuing equity to different teams and departments, because I don't think that this is totally fair. I don't think that different roles, especially at this level, contribute that big of a difference. Next up, women don't move up in companies. When you move up in companies, you get more equity. This is most pronounced in finance. I found this really surprising. The only team where non-managers, which is the bar on the left, where non-managers are more than 50% of employees is in finance. But what happens is when you get up to the CFO level, they disappear. They just go away. Where are they? They aren't there. So they disappear. And what also happens in finance is that the amount of equity you are given increases by 26 times from the lower level roles to a CFO. So again, percent of women goes down, equity value goes up. So this is where that gap is coming from, and it's especially pronounced in finance roles, which is somewhat ironic because they figure out how much equity people get. I'm just offending all CFOs right now, so apologies. We love CFOs. They buy Carta. They're great, but they can do better. So the other thing that we see is that engineers get outsized equity. And engineers, the percent of women is always below 25%. And when you increase in role or position, your equity value goes up. But what's crazy is that when you look at non-manager engineer roles, they get double the equity of any other non-manager role on average. So an average engineer coming in 2 years out of school gets double the equity of a person on the finance team, for instance. That seems crazy too. And I think we need to take a systematic look, like I said, at how we give equity to different teams and companies. Because it's hard to hire on all teams. And lots of people have huge contributions to the company. So let's go back a little bit and let's talk about overall what we're seeing. So wealth is highly concentrated amongst a few people. We all know that. It's getting worse in America, et cetera. This is even worse with equity. Equity is not well distributed. So 20% of owners hold 96% of the equity value. So I always try to do this in rooms, and it's always kind of hard. My math skills fail me again. But let's imagine that in this room, the first row and a half held all of the equity or got all of the snacks and all of the food, and nobody else got snacks or food. That's what's happening. And that's not fair. And then also imagine that only like one column, so just some people over there, they were the only women. So that's what we're looking at. It's highly concentrated. And of the 20% that are really wealthy, only 9% of them are women. So all of this wealth is held by men when it comes to equity on cap tables. So if we look at this through another lens, which we call cap table millionaires, most people are saying paper millionaires. So whatever way you want to think about it, there's a lot of wealth locked up on cap tables, especially as companies stay private longer and companies don't offer liquidity events. There's a lot of wealth. So let's just imagine that suddenly, I don't know, someone just came down and gave liquidity to everyone on a cap table. So if that were to happen, we wanted to know what percent of those millionaires are women. And 1 in 5 of those millionaires would be women. And this gets lower as we go up in sort of 10 millionaires and 100 millionaires. And if you go to tablestakes.com, shameless plug, where we released this study that has a lot more data and is a lot longer, you can look at like numbers and breakdowns at different levels as well. And so here's a summary of the data that we just talked about. So we have a gap in equity. It's 49 or 48 cents, or 26 when you combine it and do weird math. Women are not being promoted or are not in higher level roles. They're also not in the C-level roles that get the most equity. And then finally, if a bunch of millionaires were created today, 4 out of 5 of those would be men. So what can we do? The first thing you can do is you can educate yourself about equity. Anyone in this room can do that. We put out a lot of resources on Carta recently around what to look for when you get an equity offer or what to ask for. We also put out something that I'm really excited about called the Employee Shareholder Bill of Rights, which is not only for employees, but also for founders of companies to know what do fair equity practices look like. What do the best companies do? What should they do? And this is along the lines of things like liquidation preferences and how long after you leave till you exercise options. Some companies only give you 90 days. That perpetuates the problem that we have. Only the wealthy few can afford to exercise their options within 90 days. So these are some resources you can do to just educate yourself. And if you educate yourself on this, you're in a better position. You can also look for companies that care about diversity or look for investors who care about diversity. We also believe that no matter who you're raising from, no matter who you are, you should ask your investors about their track record investing in underrepresented minorities. And we think that everyone should be doing that. And on the flip side, when we go into investors, we believe that investors should be asking about diversity as well. So investors should be asking about leadership teams, about boards, et cetera. In California, it's required that public companies have at least one woman on their board. We think that that should be a requirement in private companies as well. And in fact, we are working with a government relations firm, which is the term for a lobbying firm, but to do good things, which is to make some of these things required for private companies. So no matter who you are, no matter the role, there are things you can do to close the gap now. It starts with education. It starts with understanding the gap. It starts with understanding how equity works, which we know can be a black box, but we're hoping to help demystify at Carta with things like this that we're doing. So in the end, I hope all of this inspires you to spread the word about this and do what you can to close the gap. And check out the study at tablestakes.com/study and share it. And thank you all for your time. And just being in this room gives me hope. So thank you.